Hi friends, this is Josh from the Narrate team. This weekend is the final part of Narrate's series, Add Value. Adam asked the question, how do you give your work boundaries, and points to part of the Bible that detail work and rest.
Hi, you guys. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Adam, and I'm the weakest link on staff here. Never has that become more apparent, and never has that been more satisfying. You know, I was thinking, so the 8:30 gets to come to the 10, and the 10 gets to come to the 11:30, but what about you poor 11:30 people? You should get, a gold star or something. So good job. We pick on you all the time for always being late, and look at you. You're here, and you didn't get to go an hour later than normal, so way to go. This morning, we're headed towards communion, and so I want to kind of move quickly through that, but this morning, the conversation that I want to provoke is around work. Really, I want to ask this question: What if that passion you have for your work and all the trouble that passion gets you in relationally, what if you arrived at that kind of honestly? What if the fact that you love to work, and oftentimes the greatest conflict in your marriage or in your relationships in general, in your relationship with your kids, is the fact that you love to work? What if none of us should be surprised by that? What if we have this stupid statement, we say happy wife, happy life. So chauvinistic, and you should not say that. Okay, let's just agree. Jesus wouldn't say happy wife, happy life. But isn't it far more accurate to say happy job, happy life? Does anything make you more miserable across the board than if you are just completely miserable within your work, or miserable because you don't have work, or if you're married to someone who's miserable in their work? I mean, what if the fact that, when you meet somebody, and there's this thing we all vow never to say it, but we all say it, you meet somebody, and what do you say third sentence into the conversation? What do you do for a living? What do you do for work? And you're like, oh, I became that guy. But what if that's somewhat natural, because working is such a central human thing? Some of you are stay-at-home parents, and listen, I understand sometimes that's a great thing. But I also understand that for many of you, maybe most of you who've made that decision, that's also an incredibly intense, personal, difficult thing. And what if the fact that not having work in the traditional sense and having to redefine work and all that comes with that emotionally and spiritually and relationally, what if that is somewhat predictable? If you're a student and there's this thing, again, a question people ask you, what are you going to do when you grow up, right? Or what are you going to do when you graduate? And again, it's another one of those questions we shouldn't ask, but there's this angst. I met with a few 20-somethings here a few weeks ago, and it was just this really vivid reminder to me of how much angst is in you when you're in that age, and you have this sense of everyone else knows what they're going to do with their life, but I don't, but I'm a loser because my dad knew, even though he really didn't, but I don't, and there's that thing that happens. What if that's because work and finding meaning in the work we do is so vital? See, what I'm getting at here is when you look at the text, if you take the text seriously, if you trust the text actually has something to say about what it means to be alive and to thrive in 21st century North America, then we shouldn't be surprised that work is such a vital part of your life, because the text starts there. Now, one context that you could read Genesis 1, the first chapter of the Bible, would be to say that these people were in Babylon. They had been outcasts from Jerusalem. They were in Babylon. That they had no sense of purpose or culture. Everything they knew in their old way of life was gone. Their God was gone. Everything about life as a Jewish person had been taken from them. And then there was these murmurings that started. There was this swell that was beginning. And there was a sense of if we go back there, could we go back there? But who are we if we go back there? And who is this God? And who is this God compared to the Babylonian God? And in Genesis 1, listen to what this God says to these people trying to understand what it means to be his and who he is. Then God said. Now that word then is important. And it's important because it tells us that God had been up to something. And before God started to create people, what was God doing? He was working. He was taking chaos. That's what you knew as a Jewish person in Babylon. Chaos, darkness. And he was bringing order. He was bringing light. For some of you, that's a spreadsheet. There's all these numbers and they make no sense, and I can put them in this spreadsheet. He was inventing things. He was bringing order to things. He was bringing value to things. That's what he was doing. And then this God goes, okay, so this is great. I'm making things. I'm bringing order to things. I think I'm going to bring some people along with me. And listen to what it says. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, Like, let's make them like us so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So wouldn't it make sense that a God who is so, he works, and he works so much, wouldn't it make sense that when he makes people, he would make them to work and to find this deep satisfaction? See, there's this thing that happens because you feel guilty that you oftentimes enjoy those 5 days more than the other 2. And it's an incredible source of strife in your relationship. And it's not that we don't have to bring balance there, but what if it's because that's who God is and that's who you are? And as your business fails or as you don't know what your career looks like, there's this thing that happens that just, well, it's unhuman. That's what the text seems to be saying. Listen to verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves along the ground. So God creates this order, and then he needs people to manage it, shape it, move it forward, make it better, like bring advancement to it. So here's what I want to delve into this morning. For those of you who love to work, or for those of you who are deeply dissatisfied that you don't love your work, like you meet God there. And we're in this series called Add Value. We've been talking about vocation and saying, what if we understood ourselves like the Reformation really brought to the surface, John Wesley, others like him, and said, wait a minute, ministry is not just what happens under a church when you wear a collar. That's ministry, but it's not exclusive. It doesn't have a patent on that work. Anytime you do things in the name of serving God to serve people, that's valid. That's what we've been saying. This morning, what I want to delve into is much more specifically your work as it relates to that thing you do to get a paycheck. And if you don't get a paycheck, maybe it's because you're a student or you're a stay-at-home parent, and let's just call that your work. And the question that I want to ask, and in some ways, the funnel that we've been driving this whole thing toward, the question I want to ask is simply this: how do you give your work boundaries? Like, how are you containing all that energy, all that desire, all that fun, all that enthusiasm? How are you giving it boundaries? See, oftentimes when we talk about boundaries, the implication is it's all negative. Right? We even see this in Genesis 1. God says to Adam, don't eat from that tree or you'll die. And then the serpent shows up and says to Eve, like, did God really say you shouldn't eat from any of the tree? Which, of course, isn't true. And Eve says, do you remember what Eve says to the serpent? God says we shouldn't even touch it or we'll die. That's a boundary. Like, God didn't say you can't touch it. He said you couldn't eat it. But there's this tendency we have, which can be a great thing, to give guardrails to things that are dangerous. And so we talk about boundaries as it relates to toxic people and toxic substances and toxic decisions, and those are great things. But don't we also give boundaries to healthy things, to important things, to valuable things? I mean, let's talk about food. Does food, I mean, it's both great and it needs boundaries, isn't it? Or let's go to the other side. How about exercise? Any serious exerciser will tell you, no, boundaries also need, you can go too far with your exercise. Or how about sex? In case you weren't feeling awkward, let's just help you with that. Fascinating that there's all kinds of research to say that the people who are most sexually satisfied are people who have given it healthy boundaries. So good things, great things also need boundaries. And in the text, as much as God says you're made to work, it says you're made to give your work boundaries. Listen to the very end of what really is chapter 1, but when they gave it chapter and verse, it became the first couple verses of chapter 2. Starting in verse 2, listen to this. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. So you've got a God who works, but you've also got a God who doesn't work. Listen to verse 3. Then God blessed the seventh day. That's an important word. We'll come back to that. And made it holy because on it he rested from all the work he had been doing. Now, observers will note, up until this point, before this point, after this point, God blessed animals. He blessed the creatures of the sea in Genesis 1. He blessed people. Blessing involves fruitfulness. Blessing involves, like, go make more of that. Move the story forward. Here he blesses a day, seemingly unprecedented in the text. He blesses an inanimate, like a day is not a living thing, and yet the implications of his blessing the day say, what about this day of rest? That it's productive. And so this God introduces a whole new idea into the human conversation and says, wait a minute, not doing things, doing nothing can also be productive. Ever notice that sometimes your best solutions to a problem, that they don't come when you're actively thinking about the problem? They come while you're like thinking about something else, doing something else, showering, great place of ideas, right? Doing something cathartic, something kinetic, but not actively thinking about the problem. See, this God says you need to work, but sometimes the best work you'll do is when you're not working, which creates all kinds of fascinating conversations about what happens then in a culture where we never turn things off, where we're always stimulated by media, where we always have something playing, listening to something, doing something, staring at a screen somewhere. There's a book on the mind map that I pointed out called Deep Work. It'll mess with you. It's quite challenging. It's written by an MIT professor, and it begs us to consider what is the cost of always being plugged in. Now, we could talk about that. I'm going to skip right over that. I just want to ask the question, how are you giving your work boundaries? And are you aware of the need for that? Now, here's where it gets tricky. I've been wrestling with this message for months because what's not lost on me is my life's not your life and your life's not the person next to you. I mean, I work for a church, so I really only work on Sundays. So, there's only so far I can take this conversation. Right? But I'm not an electrician. And I'm not retired from the military, and I'm not a manager, and I'm not a business owner, and I'm not an attorney, and I'm not a doctor. I'm not a barista. I'm not a college student or a high school student. I don't sell anything. I don't sell paint or insurance or cars. I suppose we all sell something. And so there's a conversation that I can start, but I can't answer the questions for you. The only thing I can say is this. Well, here's the only thing I'll say. If you don't have an answer to the question, how are you giving your work boundaries? What might that say about the presence of boundaries as it relates to your work? And if there's not been conversation about your boundaries with that job or that business that you love, or those grades that you feel like you have to have, that team that you have to have succeed, those clients that deserve your service, if there's not been a conversation, then what are the implications of that? I didn't realize until really in the last several years that there was a person in my life who from a very early place in my early 20s was constantly in my ear saying things to me like, Adam, do not sacrifice your family on the altar of ministry. Now I know it's like you only work on Sunday. That wasn't my context. My context, and I'm grateful for those who taught me to do what I do, but that context was 70, 80 hours a week. That context was you don't take a day off, and if you do take a day off, you better come back after dinner. That context was you work as hard and as long as you have to get the job done, and if that requires 80 hours, so be it, and if that means you don't see your kids all week, so be it. And there was a guy in my life who was saying things to me like, hey, Adam, I hope if you can pick between A+ communicator and C+ dad, or C+ communicator and A+ dad, I hope you pick the second one. What he didn't tell me is what happens when you become C+ at both? That's its own conversation. He was saying things like, Adam, the best thing you can do for your ministry is prioritize your marriage. The best thing you can do for your kids is have a great marriage. I didn't realize how radical it was until recently. And part of the problem, I think, is you're not just trying to win at your job, are you? Like, that's what makes this so hard. You love what you do. You love the vision of your company. You love your clients. You love the people that you serve. And yet you wouldn't be here if you weren't well aware of the fact that that's not the only place you want to win. Like, you want to win in your relationship with God. That's why you're here, whether you're pursuing Him or following Him. And you understand that to do that come up with all kinds of excuses. That's going to require time in your daily. It's going to require time in the scriptures, time in praying, time to memorize things, time where you can develop and deepen a relationship with God. You want to win with your spouse, with your friends, with your kids. That's what makes this thing so difficult, isn't it? And so again, I don't have the answers. I can't say like, here's what it means to be an electrician or an attorney or a barista or a student. But I do want to challenge you by way of two stories. The first one comes from a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. You may have heard of him. In 1876, he was a student at Harvard. Harvard. It was Harvard College at the time. I believe it's probably a university today. And the historians say, I've been reading up on him some, that in 1876, had you enrolled at Harvard, you would have invariably become acquainted with this mutton-chopped, wiry, hyper-energetic guy that we know as Teddy Roosevelt. They said if you'd have got to know him, you'd have been frustrated by him because he was a bit of a paradox. He was a student at Harvard with competitive grades, but if you were a fellow student, you would have quickly noted it seemed like he was never there. Furthermore, he had all these interests. He was into boxing and wrestling and bodybuilding, clearly. He was into poetry. He loved to write it and to read it and to be part of forums where those two things were done. He loved to dance, took classes constantly. He was also a consummate naturalist. Even in college, he got himself in trouble with the school and landlords because he would love to go into the hills and kill himself a bird and then bring it back to his dorm room. And he got in trouble for turning his dorm room into a taxidermy because then he would gut it and stuff it and hang it on the wall. And his fellow students, they were stymied by him because it was like he was never at the school, but his grades were just fine. Well, history is kind of unearthed, and they've been working on it. And of course, there's all kinds of biographers who have observed his life. Some guys say that the way Roosevelt did it, they call it Rooseveltian intensity. And what that meant, part of his strategy, this is crazy and will help you with your anxiety, not really, but one of his strategies was if he determined that it took 4 hours, he was going to need 4 hours to study for a test, he would allot 3. And his thinking was, if I give myself less time than I need, I don't waste any. I just bear down and get the job done. He did that collectively within his school week. What they now understand is from 8:30 to 5:30, you would find him in the school at the library. If he wasn't in class and he wasn't exercising and he wasn't eating lunch, those are the two things other than school that he did from 8:30 to 5:30. From 8:30 to 5:30, if he wasn't in class and he wasn't eating, he wasn't exercising, he was doing something related to school. That was his deal. Nothing else. No iPhone, no internet, no what the Broncos do today. None of that stuff. That's all he did. And at 5:30, done. Done. His deal was, I am going to give this Harvard thing all the energy I can muster for these 45 hours, and then I'm done. And history would record he wasn't valedictorian, but apparently he did well enough to become a president of the United States. Apparently he did well enough to be competitive. One of his historians says this about him. The amount of time he spent at his desk was comparatively small, but his concentration so intense and his reading so rapid that he could afford more time off from school than most. Now, this reminds me of a guy named Bill Hybels, who I heard say when I was in my 20s. He used to say, I'm no longer impressed by somebody who tells me they work 60 hours a week. No longer impressed by someone who tells me they work 70 or 80. He said, because I've been around long enough to understand that doesn't represent your productivity. That it's quite possible to log 70 hours in the office and 40 being productive. Right? If you'd asked your boss 20 years ago, some of you are like, well, I was not outside the womb 20 years ago, but just stick with me. If you'd asked your boss 20 years ago, hey, could I put a cable TV on my desk? They'd laughed at you. And let's be honest, that's what we carry on in our back pocket all the time. That's what we have on our computer. What if there was a transition in your mindset and you went, wait a minute, this 20-minute foray on ESPN.com, not that I know anything about that type of activity, I'm not cheating my company, because I'm just going to stay 20 minutes later. I'm cheating my wife, my kids. I'm going to strung the string of I'm so busy and I got so much to do. But in reality, really? Or do you have this habit? Some research, and you can dig into this through deep work too, there's ample research that would say you can only be productive for about 45 hours a week. And you can spread that out over 70, or you can compress it into 40 or 45, but your anatomy doesn't allow you to do that for longer than that. This guy who wrote this book, Deep Work, this MIT professor, he talks about deep work and how hard it is to actually do dedicated thinking, and he would say the most attuned thinkers can really only think that deeply for 5 hours a day, which adds up to how many in a work week? So the question I guess I'm posing is, what if you applied the Rooseveltian intensity? And what if this sense of wait a minute, I have to work this hard. What if there's all kinds of wasted energy See, it seems that one of the questions we're asking is, if we just go back to the bare bones simplicity of Jesus and his message. In Luke 10, Jesus says this in response to some critics: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, isn't the question we're really asking, how are you going to distribute yourself? We all have the same amount of time to work with. How are you going to distribute that? I was 24 years old. I attended a simulcast conference in Billings, which I don't particularly like because I'm distracted by my email and stuff, and I just like to go away to a conference. But I went to the simulcast, the whole staff did. And it was there that I heard of for the first time and then heard speak for the first time a guy by the name of Andy Stanley. Never heard of him, never heard him speak, but he caught my attention because the title of his message was Cheat the Church, which for a guy who leads a church is kind of an ironic, counterintuitive message title. He went on to share a story where when he was first starting North Point Church, of course, a church that is today the second largest church in North America, and in my estimation, he's the best leader and the best communicator in the world. When he was starting this church in Atlanta, Georgia, had all this potential. The thing was blowing up. It was doing awesome. He had a wife at home with 2 toddlers and a third on the way. And one day, he just had enough self-awareness to look at his wife and go like, so how you doing? And he'd seen enough carnage in his life to know, like, we can keep putting loads on a spouse or on a friend or on an employee, and we can just keep adding load, and it looks like they're doing fine. And suddenly the bottom falls out, and there's all this carnage and all this wreckage in terms of relationships. And so he just wanted to make sure that wasn't happening. He watched his own dad's marriage blow up, his own parents' marriage. And she, Sandra's her name, she kind of was like, oh, yeah, it's fine, did the kind of whatever thing. And he pushed a little harder, and he said, no, seriously, how's it going? And she started to confide in him. She said, I love what I do. I love getting to stay home with the kids, multifaceted, multi-talented. She had other things going on. I love it. And then she said, but by 4 o'clock, I'm done. And she started to just confide in him, like, I'm just out of gas by 4 o'clock. And he said, well, how do I help you with that? And she said, well, is there a way that you could arrange your days that you're home at 4 o'clock every day? And the verse that quickly came to mind for him was from Paul, when Paul said, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And for some reason, what stood out to him was God never called him to love his job or even the church as Christ loved the church. He called him to love his spouse as Christ loved the church. And so he went to work and he arranged his work life in such a way that he didn't work beyond 4 o'clock. He was home by 4 o'clock. For him, that meant no evening meetings, which is kind of rare in church world. The only exception was his council and his finance meetings. For him, that meant no travel, and he was a renowned communicator already. He had all kinds of opportunities to go all over the country and speak, and for a large season of his life, the answer was no, because he prioritized being home at 4 and being home that night. And then he went on to share that what he began to realize in that decision was that he made a decision that he was going to cheat his job of his time. That we all have the same amount to work with and we can divvy it up however we want, but he decided, I'm going to cheat someone, and it's not going to be my kids and it's not going to be my wife. And what I loved about his mindset is what he began to realize, he said, was that essentially, effectively, literally what he started to do is he started to go, Lord, I'm going to give these 45 hours. Now, in his case, it was his church. I'm going to give these 45 hours to this job. And whatever you can build with those 45 hours, whatever kind of organization, or in your case, company or income or whatever you can do with that, I welcome that. But that's what I have to give this endeavor. Now, I think what lends itself credibility to his story is that coupled with that is the fact that it's the second largest church in the United States. So apparently it wasn't a limiting factor. I remember hearing that message, walking out into the halls. I had been working full-time at this church for no more than a year, had been an intern prior to that. My wife was at home. We were recent graduates from college. We had a baby at home. And I remember seeing a friend, a mentor, someone whom I had hugely respected, who had himself just started to plant a church. I remember seeing him in the hall and going, wasn't that amazing? There was a sense of like, that was incredible. Like, that was ballsy, you might say. Like, that, wow. And I remember him looking at me going like, I could never do that. It would never work. There's no way I could accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish if I did that. Now, that was the first hint that I had that those kinds of boundaries was radical. 13 years later, I know what most of you guys know. That's not just kind of radical. It's absurd. Nobody does that. And the other thing 13 years has afforded me is to look back and go, the carnage of well-intentioned people who don't have that conversation. Listen, this morning, the challenge I have for you is to have the conversation, to start the conversation, to revisit the conversation. And listen, I get it. Some of you, you can already hear your dad, you can already hear his voice saying you're lazy. You can already hear it. The cost. You work in an office full of people, a school full of people. There's just a spoken or even unspoken expectation. No. You work 60, you work 70. You stay here till 7 o'clock. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not even saying it's completely doable in the direct translation. I'm just challenging you. What kind of boundaries? Some of you, if you were to be honest, really the only part of your life that brings you joy and hope is your work life. And so you're going to have to dig in. You're going to have to look to the person you're married to, the person you live with, and kind of go like, okay, I got to figure this out because I've never had to confess to you before. I like my work. I don't really like anything else about our life. The challenge I have for you is how are you giving it boundaries? You might not even be able to work there. But what if it's not about your productivity? What if it's doable? What if you could bear down and get it done? What if you could teach them, you don't have to work 70 hours a week. You just have to stop surfing your phone all the time. What if you could demonstrate, no, there's a way of being productive that defies time. Again, I don't know what this looks like because I work in my job with its rhythms and its routines and you work in yours. But will you broach the subject? And just consider, okay, Lord, so who am I cheating with my time? And if and when you decide that you want it to be your job. I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were talking about C.S. Lewis, who, of course, is one of the most impactful Christ followers to ever live. And one of the things that stood out to me is they were talking about him, they talked about the 30 years that he was really making an impact on the kingdom. And it just stood out to me like, 30 years? I mean, we think of C.S. Lewis as this immortal guy who's had 30 years is what his career lasted. That's nothing. It's nothing. You're going to be a husband for way longer than that. Some of you, you've already been a parent for longer, 30 years. Will you have the conversation? And listen, for those of you who Jesus is an enigma and you're here because you're intrigued, we have a great staff who would love to help you. You would just need to take the first step and let us know. Let me pray, and we're going to give you a chance to worship through communion. God, Lord, this is easy stuff to talk about, and for some of us, it's incredibly radical as we try to live it out. Some of us work in sectors or in organizations that don't even allow for this kind of decision. Some of us, Lord, we have voices in our head, and we couldn't even look ourselves in the mirror if we did it this way. Jesus, I pray that your voice and your spirit would prevail. I pray for students and singles in the room who they feel like they have nothing but time. Would you give them wisdom as to how to create healthy margin? Would you store some of this stuff away that they could apply it when they apparently have less time? God, we want to be productive over the long haul and in the right order. And so, God, would you help us clarify what it looks like to give our work as an offering to you, to be fully engaged in our work. God, work as hard as we know how. And you recognize that we can only have so much control over its impact. Would you protect us from the thinking that says if we just gave it 10 or 20 or 30 more hours, we could have greater impact, God? Would you take our work and increase it 150, even 20-fold? We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.